Dr. Renate Klien lives on Juru country and is a biologist and social scientist. She has spent the last 40 years critiquing reproductive technologies and genetic engineering, including surrogacy. Her two latest books are Surrogacy, a Human Rights Violation, and Broken Bonds, Surrogate Mothers Speak Out. With Susan Hawthorne, she founded Spinifex Press 30 years ago.
The Declaration on Women's Sex-Based Rights is a brilliant and much-needed document. And of course, I totally affirm the need to use sex-based theory in anything to do with reproduction and bodily integrity. But the problem is that women have already lost much of this quite a long time ago. To refocus on bodily integrity and the axiom, we are our bodies, is sorely needed today, because in the context of reproductive technologies, women began to lose the right to bodily integrity with the birth of the first so-called test tube baby, which was Louise Brown in 1978. Since then, it has become gradually accepted by society at large, and alas, by many women too, that it's perfectly okay to dismember women and use an egg cell from one woman to combine with sperm and then insert the embryo into another woman, whether that's a so-called surrogate mother, a misnomer if there ever was one, or an infertile woman to manufacture the so-called product child via IVF, which is in vitro fertilization, the proper name for the test tube procedure. Bestowed on us by kind technodocs who continue to assure us that what they are doing is, in capital letters, for our own good, to alleviate the heartbreak of involuntary childlessness and give worthy women a child. Not so many poor brown and black women or refugees or homeless women are amongst the ones that get in vitro fertilization treatment. We were told right from the word go at the end of the 70s that, quote, babies from the glass were better than what ordinary women could produce from our misshapen bodies. Hence, a myriad of tests such as prenatal genetic diagnosis were gradually introduced to supposedly guarantee the birth of a perfect baby with the correct sex as well, or gender as it is wrongly called these days. Eugenics in action. And people pay huge amounts of money for such often inconclusive tests. But if you are a critic of reproductive technologies, as I have been together with hundreds of other fin-rage women over the last 40 years, you were labeled heartless and cruel for wanting to deny women the joy of their own baby, or in the case of surrogacy, the joy of their bought baby. We are told that more than 8 million IVF babies have been born, which sounds grand at first until you ask how many women actually started treatment and never ended with a child. Given that IVF remains a failed technology that is rarely more successful than 25% at best, this leaves us with a staggering 32 million women who underwent the grueling IVF procedures, which involves being put into menopause and then started afresh with fertility hormones to produce dozens of ripe egg cells instead of the usual one per month, with no baby at the end. It is important to point out the scandalous fact that no long-term international studies have been or are in process to check on the long-term health of these women. That's how little women's health and indeed our lives count. Once they have been deemed, quote, faulty breeders, they are cast by the wayside, left to deal with their own crumbling physical and emotional health. But we know from smaller studies that there are elevated numbers of breast and ovarian cancers in women who underwent IVF. A big price to pay, but no one cares. And by the way, there are an increasing number of health issues detected in children born of IVF, now adults, especially serious cardiovascular problems, but that's for another talk. Unfortunately, a similar story has to be told for so-called, quote, egg donors, mostly young women who go through the same dangerous procedures and who are also diagnosed with higher numbers of cancers. Every time you see two gay men holding, quote, their baby in their arms, think of the two women who this child is unlikely ever to know, the genetic mother, quote, meaning the egg donor, and their mother, who made them from her own blood and bone and gave birth to her or him. A clear example of sex-based discrimination and violence. Reproductive prostitution, no less. One other thing I must point out is that in parallel with the spread of IVF as a huge money-making international empire, and we are talking billions every year, was the quest to develop an artificial womb. Clearly, the end game was and is that women can be entirely dispensed with. But we're not there yet, although in 2017, the so-called Biobag was constructed in the US. It is a plastic envelope into which poor lamb fetuses were stuck. And actually, some of them developed until maturity and lived for some time, only about 2 or 3 of them. The same researchers are now working and got quite a lot of funding on perfecting this biobag for human preterm fetuses. And so it will creepy, crawly in. Apart from removing reproduction entirely from women with an artificial womb, it has recently been possible in animal experiments to manufacture sperm and egg cells from ordinary body cells. Once this research is perfected, it is truly goodbye to any kind of physical and reproductive integrity or control for women. From there, it will be a small step to transhumanism. But again, we're not there yet. But this is a very scary development. Usually, I don't take much notice of these things because they're always hyped up, but this is a scary development. Accompanying the development of reproductive technologies was the philosophy of postmodernism, which says in a nutshell that there is no such thing as truth, that we don't live our lives with our bodies, but we perform whatever we are doing. Hence, if we are a biological man, but feel like performing like women, then hey bingo, we are women. And as a matter of fact, much better ones than these old-fashioned ex-dinosaurs, us women here. And that's not all. The underlying misogynist, violent, women-hating dismemberment of reproductive technologies continues seamlessly to the latest medical frontier. The transplanting of wombs from women, of course, into male-bodied so-called trans women. There have been less than 20 births of babies by women into whose bodies a uterus was transplanted. And heaven knows what the anti-rejection drugs that the women has to take will do to the health of the developing baby. So the idea that this might work in male-bodied people is true pie in the sky. Nevertheless, this idea was seriously discussed in reputable scientific journals in 2021, with one recent article suggesting that a womb transplant would make the male-bodied so-called trans woman feel more like a, quote, real woman. But I would suggest that you real women who are listening now, stop for a second and feel your womb and see if it does anything for you. It is seriously bizarre to discuss these developments, and I urge particularly young women to reject reproductive technologies and fiercely resist these attacks on your body and on your life. It is late, but I don't think it is too late. So thank you for that.